Aerinn, great to have you here. But before we begin, I just want to ask a question. What did one cunning woman's cat say to the other cunning woman's cat?
I don't know. What did one cunning woman's cat say to the other cunning woman's cat?
You look familiar. Oh, my God. That is a terrible... Have you heard that joke before?
No, I haven't heard that, but you got me with that one. I like that one.
Oh, my gosh. Well, what can you do? But I enjoy the bad jokes, so thank you for bearing with me. Hey, everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the supernatural, the paranormal, and the weird. I have been waiting to do this episode for such a long period of time, and I have a great episode for everybody. The Patreon supporters, every couple of months, I give them a list of topics to choose for what to talk about on the podcast, and this one, I had my fingers crossed for. I was like, please, 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 I really want this one to get a lot of votes because I can't wait to talk about this topic. And lo and behold, the topic of cunning folk came in second as far as the amount of votes cast. And so I was like, oh, I can't wait to do this show, but I better check in. So I checked in with the good doctor, Al Cummings, and I said, Al, I already had you on the show, and we talked about grimoires. I'm going to be talking about cunning folk. And he said, oh, Doug, you have to talk to this person. I said, really? Oh, okay. Who is this person? And this person is going to be my guest for the episode on cunning folk. So she is an artist, a magician, an animist who is inspired by the embodied mysticism of medieval visionaries and early modern community-based sorcery. She is well-versed in divination, folk magic, herbalism, and spirit work. I am joined today by the wise woman of Bushwick Avenue, Aerinn Hodges. Aerinn, how are you today?
Oh, I'm good. Wow, that sounds very grandiose.
Doesn't it? Whenever somebody says something out loud about us, we're always like, "Oh, you're far too kind." But no, Dr. Al couldn't say enough good things about you. So I'm super happy that you're here to talk to me about something that I absolutely love, and it's so important. And I want people to get the best information about this certain tradition, kind of pseudo tradition. It's just a really amazing term that we've applied to a large group of people through a large period of time. So with that, I'd like to get into it. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm so ready. And thank you for having me. This is one of my very favorite topics to talk about.
Perfect. So before we get it, the question that always has to be asked is, what are the cunning folk? Who were the cunning folk?
Okay, simply put, I think of the cunning folk as sort of idiosyncratic, working class, professional magicians. I tend to see the term cunning folk applied mostly to late medieval and early modern England, sometimes spilling a little beyond there, but the term has also come to be applied in the English language to similar social and magical roles elsewhere in Europe and in colonial America as well. And the cunning folk, when I think of it etymologically, they were people that had knowledge. Cunning comes from the word knowledge. And so they were a professional class who possessed more knowledge than those around them. Right. And in this case, usually came from a supernatural source of some kind, typically a spirit or a magical book, which in turn might put them in contact with spirits. Mm-hmm. And their practices tied together really diverse knowledge bases, combining things like astrology, herbalism, folk religion, alchemy, and various local traditions.
Wonderful. And so when you say those things, a lot of people would just be like, oh, you're talking about a witch. You're basically describing a witch. And what would you say would be the difference between cunning folk and a witch / sorcerer?
I think that the village witch of the popular imagination is very much indebted to the cunning woman and has taken on a lot of her attributes. But to the early modern and the medieval mind, they would have been different entities with occasional overlap. Okay. One way that I find to be a really good entry point for thinking of cunning folk is that on average, they were anti-witches or they were unwitchers.
Okay.
That was kind of their bread and butter, was diagnosing and healing illnesses, disasters, and other afflictions caused by witchcraft or other kinds of spiritual disturbances like hauntings.
Right. Yeah, I like that the term unwitchers, because cunning folk are known as well as white witches, right?
Yeah, that became really popular among educated Protestants, especially in like the late 18th century in England. And that was really a way to lump them in with witches and sort of frame them as just as bad or even worse than witches, because seemingly they were good and innocent.
Right.
But really they were in league with the devil too, which wasn't really always the case, and it's really applied very unevenly, because we find these accusations of witchcraft were often based in a sort of classism and gendering, because it's usually lower class, working class women who find themselves subjected to these accusations and then executed for them many times, even if they were doing the exact same magic as their male neighbor. Yeah, I wouldn't identify them as witches, because for me, that's the thing that would get usually women killed specifically.
Right.
But when they were just practicing the exact same magic as either men in the same sort of communities, or even as upper class magicians. So they weren't doing anything differently that could be identified as specifically witchcraft.
The activities that you described earlier of what cunning folk did, overall, what would you say somebody in a village would go to one of the cunning folk for? Like, is it just divination, or would they receive blessings? Would they get curses taken off of them? What else was in their purview?
They were very diversely skilled practitioners of magic and medicine. I think that unwitching is definitely the staple that we see most often, as well as other forms of healing. But yes, divination, treasure hunting, love magic, finding lost or stolen goods, exorcisms, dowsing, protection, all of these things and more were definitely in the cunning person's wheelhouse. And I think by being so diversely skilled, many of them were like linchpins for their communities and provided sort of accessible explanations, counseling, and solutions for mundane as well as supernatural problems faced by the people who sought them out.
Is there some distinct differences between different countries or regions of Europe when cunning folk were active? Were there things that certain cunning folk would say in England would do that definitely wouldn't wash in, say, the area that we now call Germany? Is there something that makes cunning folk more distinct in one area than another?
I think that sometimes in other areas, you might find much more specific practitioners as opposed to the kind of generalist cunning folk often were. But I think you do find these kind of generalist practitioners in a lot of places throughout Europe under different names, maybe with different specific skill sets. But you do find people like unwitchers in places like rural France, in places on the Iberian Peninsula, who are doing things like matchmaking via magic, who are doing things like a bit of amateur sort of folk astrology. Yeah, I think there are differences, but my areas of research really focus on the British Isles, only occasionally sort of going outward into other areas like France, Germany, and places like that.
What function did cunning folk serve in their communities? Were they mainly seen as being like a positive force or positive influence, or were they viewed with a bit more suspicion? What's the best way of putting cunning folk? I know we're talking about such a long period of time, but what were they mainly seen as within the communities themselves?
I think there was always a mix of trepidation with seeing them as also essential parts of their communities. Yeah, we're not talking about people that were necessarily operating in secret or anything like that. There definitely was some suspicion around them. You find records of people being like, oh, so-and-so might be in league with the devil. But a lot of those accusations didn't necessarily reflect the cunning folks' practices in their own words. So that was sort of the outside looking in, like, where does this mysterious power come from? And not being able to identify it easily. So the easy go-to accusation, is maybe this is the devil, but we're still going to go to them.
Right.
And in other cases, you had people coming forward if someone was accused of witchcraft being like, oh, no. She's helped 3 generations of my family. She's a good woman. She may have some charms or some spells, but it's not witchcraft. That's something else.
Right. Would everybody in the town kind of know who the cunning was there? I mean, I'm thinking that there's just one in every town, but I would suspect that there'd be more than one. But would everybody know their name?
It seems at least that they operated fairly openly in many communities and were often very undeterred by any laws criminalizing their activities.
Nice.
And occasionally reputations preceded them at quite a distance. You have records of prospective clients traveling 20 miles or more in hopes of a cure, charm, or spell, even bypassing other cunning folk because they heard that so-and-so 3 villages over was so much better, so much more qualified. This sort of like word of mouth Yelp of cunning folk definitely was happening, which you can't get if they are these secret, unknown people. So there's definitely the sense that if people are coming forward to defend them from accusations of witchcraft, if people are traveling great distances to see them, they were definitely well known. And the later you get in the period that they were really active, especially into the 18th, 19th century, you see cunning folk occasionally distributing flyers, advertising in print media. So this wasn't super common, but it did happen. And this self-promotion, while it might acquire them a lot of clients, is a double-edged sword because, of course, it could also attract unwanted attention of legal authorities, clerical authorities, which could result in prosecutions for sorcery, cozening, fraud, or witchcraft.
Wow. Yeah, I love the idea of flyers. I was just about to say is like when you talk about one cunning folk in one area being better at something, it's like there would be a Michelin guide or something like, this town has the cunning folk that's really good at divination, but this one's got a cunning folk who's really good at curse lifting. I love it. I just love it to death. Question. Did druidic it's a fraught term, pagan practical magic techniques just morph into cunning practices? For example, say did something like trolldom or Norse folk magic just become cunning? Or did the old ways eventually just fall away when things like in Scandinavia, something like the Cyprianus or the Svartbok, they became the norm for cunning folk? What do you think happened?
I don't know that pagan practices became cunning craft in a kind of one-on-one sense. I think there is a continuum there that happened. Okay. We definitely see pagan or seeming practices existing alongside or within people's individual cunning craft because this is such an individualistic, quote unquote tradition that we're talking about.
Yeah.
For example, there's a charm to help a sick person sleep that calls upon angels in the Old Testament figure of Ishmael that appears in a 10th century manuscript alongside charms invoking the name of Odin.
Right.
And then we see some 600 years later, this very same charm or a variation on it in a cunning person's working book, which was published as the Book of Oberon in 2011. And it features, this riff on this same charm invoking Ishmael. And instead of generic angels, it's the Archangel Michael to help someone suffering from insomnia or disturbed sleep. So I do think that there is this continuum there that's happening, but I don't want to feed into this idea that cunning folk were secret pagans or anything like that. I think that many of them would have identified as Christian and they lived in this Christian spiritual and cultural milieu. They might even be in contact with seemingly pagan spirits, like a fairy or a squirrel, like an animal spirit, but many of them identified themselves as Christian. And so, there's this sort of fluidity to it. And we see some cunning women talking about praying to the planets as though the planets are, maybe they're not God, but there's something accessible there. Like they're living in this Christian crypto animist world at this point. I think that is really fascinating to me because it does have these pagan or pagan seeming elements to it existing right alongside using Catholic prayers to cure people or to exorcise someone.
Right. Let's talk a bit about what you just brought up. Would it be fair to say that, again, long period of time, kind of pseudo-tradition, but would it be fair to say that in Europe specifically and the British Isles, that most cunning folk were religious, Christian, and they would use the Bible as kind of like their go-to grimoire?
Yeah, I think that they usually would identify as Christian, or specifically in England, Catholicism was their old religion.
Right.
And was called that, using that exact term. Cunning women in particular, when faced with accusations of witchcraft, this often went hand in hand with accusations of popery, of being too Catholic seeming in some way.
Right.
And so I do think that, they were turning to the Bible. They were turning into traditional prayers that maybe didn't come straight out of the Bible, but were sort of part of a Catholic folk corpus of practices, exorcisms, prayers, and blessings, whether they were ultra pious, as some certainly were, or never attended church as others did, they definitely made use of the techniques and the technology that the Catholic Church provided them and that Christianity provided them to produce amulets, to say charms for healing or exorcisms or blessings. So I don't think they were like how we think of contemporary pious Christians in, a Western sense these days. But by the standards of their time, I think that they were Christian. It just wasn't a Christianity we might recognize now.
So let's use for an example, say the British Isles. Would it be common to see a cunning person in church?
Some certainly yes, and others very much no. And the ones who were not seen in church, that was often used against them if they ever did become subject to accusations of witchcraft. Oh, well, goody so-and-so, I haven't seen her in church in like 3 years.
Right.
So we do see cunning women accused of witchcraft who might have their absence from church used against them or weaponized against them in some way. And then we have other people, and Bodenham, who's one of my favorite cunning folk to study and research, because there's just so much about her out there. She was one of those people questioned about her Christianity. She talked about having her own prayers. She said she was a devout Christian, but she had her own prayers. It wasn't the common prayer book. It wasn't going to church.
Right.
And the implication sort of being that maybe these are the prayers from the grimoires that she had, because she's known to have had a library and to have been part of a network of people who were exchanging books and things like that. And of course, this was all weaponized against her to become, oh, she's a witch in a coven.
Yeah.
Even though she's saying psalms and saying prayers that were identifiably Christian. Yeah, it's interesting how there's this tension there. What is Christian enough?
Right. So somebody could get not a slap on the wrist, but they could be accused of something, even though they're said like, no, I am using my own prayers. It's like, well, you're not using the prayers in this book. So therefore you're right. We know something's up. That's interesting. I love that. Which brings me to this question. How literate do you think, I'm not asking for percentages or anything like that, but how literate were some of the cunning folk?
I think very literate, especially the later we go in time. Okay. And even the ones who weren't literate, it was an aspiration for many, I would imagine, and increasingly a necessity from, like, I want to say the 17th century onward, as being able to read became viewed as almost essential, as unlocking all of these different kinds of knowledge and opening an entire new skill set for cunning folk via astrology, alchemy, the grimoire, allowing them to manufacture textual amulets, which they could then sell. One cunning woman, Mary Parrish, who was literate in English, at least able to read, she went to great lengths to secure a grimoire for herself, have tracts of it translated so she could read and work with them. She sold and repurchased the same grimoire several times during her career. So there's definitely this emphasis on literacy for many cunning folk, especially, as I said, later in the period we're talking about. And someone like Anne Bodenham, who I discussed previously, she talked actively about how important reading was for her.
Okay.
She even was a teacher who taught children how to read.
Wow.
So there's this, sense of literacy for some cunning folk being so essential.
Yeah.
And then when we look at the working books that have been published recently, like the Book of Oberon, we see how diversely read some of these cunning folk really were, and how important it was for some of them to record their magical reading and experimentation. They were reading so many different texts and collecting them and collating them and cutting and pasting and collaging them almost like cut-ups to form their own systems of working sometimes. It's really fascinating to me.
Incredible.
Reading definitely was, giving cunning folk a sense of empowerment and making them look educated to clients who would come to them. There was this primitive element there too.
Now, to stick with books, besides, say, something like the Bible, are there any books that come to mind that cunning folk made use of regularly, like, say, something like Agrippa's 3 Books of Occult Philosophy? I know that a lot of flack got thrown towards the 4th book of Occult Philosophy, which was fairly popular in England, but are there any other books that come to mind that if you were to go to a cunning person's home that you would see on the shelf?
Yeah, 3 Books of Occult Philosophy and 4th book are huge ones that we know were being collected by cunning folk and other occultists at that time. And when we talk about the fourth book, even that is a collection of other books, including like the Arbital and the Heptameron, Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, great one, even though it was written to sort of dissuade people or convince people that these magical practices are so ridiculous and farcical. It had the exact opposite effect by giving cunning folk a new resource to turn to. And various books of secrets, dream books, receipt books were also really widely distributed and in use by professional and amateur magicians alike. In France, we have like the Bibliothèque Bleue era. Saw so many grimoires and magical books really widely published, distributed, peddled by traveling book salespeople all across the country and in urban and in rural areas. In Spain, there's the infamous books of Saint Cyprian, professional and village magicians of all kinds. And we see that some of these books even made it into the New World, the so-called New World, and were employed by cunning folk here too. So there's definitely a wide range of books that were published and used by cunning folk in different books in different areas. It's really fascinating to try to track those and see how they might have informed an individual region's version of what we might call cunning craft.
Amazing. Who do you think were buying Bibliothèque Bleue books? Like, we really don't know. I want to get the Aerinn Hodges take. Who do you think were buying these books? Was it just something to have on the shelf like we have the Necronomicon back in the 90s? Like what? The Simonomicon? Like, who do you think were buying these things? Because they were hugely popular.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some cases they were just for show.
Yeah.
In some cases, they were actually put to use. You know, I can't remember where I read this now, but I seem to recall that the Bibliothèque Bleue books were often bought by farmers and in use by people in rural professions, outlying areas of France, which is really interesting. In England, we often find, not always, but we often find cunning folk to more likely be skilled professionals of some kind. Not that farmers aren't skilled. That's a really bad way to put that.
No, I get it.
But we more often find it's teachers or accountants or doctors or things like that practicing cunning craft in England. Whereas in France, we are more likely to find it being like a farmer or something like that who's doing the work of the unwitching or charming off warts or things like that. Yeah, it's interesting how those sort of diffuse very differently based on region.
Yeah. In some ways also, I think the Bibliothèque Bleue books, some of them are even, they say that just having the book and not being able to read it, because some people wouldn't be able to read it, but just having them in some way was an act of magic in and of itself.
Yeah, totally. There's so many folk tales, and I find it really fascinating where we see fairy tale sort of blur into what we know about quote unquote learned magic, because we see fairy tales about like devil's books, and maybe some opens it curious what's inside and come pouring forth in some way or another. Very like Disney's Fantasia with Mickey Mouse.
I love it.
Yeah, I think there was a certain hesitation around these books, especially, I haven't noticed that as much in the British Isles, but I certainly noticed it all across Europe, continental Europe, there being a big mystification of the books. And that the books are evil in and of themselves and need to be chained up and locked away and might be like whispering things in the night or what have you, which is really interesting.
Love it.
And there's definitely people who were using them just because they thought having them granted them power, or at least for other people would be like, oh, what are all these fancy books on your shelves?
Right. I can identify with that. Yes, I like to show off the weird looking books on my shelf. Some things never change. What about things like, say, malefic magic? Now, I know you've just said that they are known more for curse lifting, but would say somebody in town had their horse stolen or one of their sheep stolen. I need to craft a curse for this guy. I know who stole this, but I can't get to them. Would they go to a cunning person for that?
Many times they might, You know, lifting curses, lifting hauntings, curing witchcraft were, as we've talked about, very frequent like menu items for cunning folk. But cunning folk also did the opposite. And there are cases where they were cursing people, working malefic magic for either their own enemies or the enemies of clients. We see this a couple times in trial records of cunning folk threatening to pay clients who wouldn't pay up also, which could attract a lot of unwanted attention.
Yeah.
And that's where we get this blurriness of the fuzzy border between cunningcraft and witchcraft, because once you're starting to hurt people, that's going more into the witchcraft end of things, at least if you're a woman, because we do see men doing things like burying, cursing talismans under pubs. I can't remember a specific person who did this, but now he's probably, I don't think he's accused of witchcraft or anything like that. He's just a cunning man doing something a little naughty. But it's interesting that the ritual actions that cure witchcraft mimic witchcraft itself.
Right.
We see cunning folk pricking the hearts of animals or effigies, or operating in like the days and hours of Saturn, who is, astrologically the lord of witches.
Right. And
sort of turning the magical language and the techniques of witchcraft or the techniques of cursing against witches. And Jean Favre Sada, she's writing in the 70s, I think, about witchcraft and unwitching in the 20th century. So a very late period, a very recent period in the grand scheme of things. And she talks about how acts of unwitching, even then, were always acts of violence equivalent to witchcraft, but deployed against witches rather than deployed against productive, innocent members of the community. So there's this sense that in a lot of ways they're one and the same, but the cunning folk, the cunning person is usually trying to help people and make a buck.
Right.
And the witch is usually just trying to hurt people, often for the sake of it, out of spite or jealousy or anger or something like that. But it's a lot of the same techniques being deployed.
It's a blurry line, if there is indeed a line at all. I have to ask, what about yourself? Do you go into malefic magic, or is that something you're like, I prefer to heal people. I like to keep that karmic wheel somewhat clean. What's your take on cursing and whatnot?
I tend to err on the side of caution, not necessarily out of a sense of karma or the sort of Wiccan threefold law or anything like that.
Right.
But I just find for me that malefic magic kind of invites a little too much chaos into my life. And I like to keep things a little more even keeled. I have enough chaos and mess on my own that I don't know that I need to be inviting any more of that or stirring up those virtues in my own life or space. But I don't judge other people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good, legitimate reasons to engage with that kind of work. There's a lot of evil out there in the world.
Yeah, I hear you. So this is a really fun question, because a lot of times when people look up cunning folk, there'll be this image. It'll show two hands, and we'll get into it a little bit. But I got to ask, because this is a term that not a lot of people know, but what is casinomancy?
A classic standby of cunning folk, for sure.
Yeah.
Dating back all the way to ancient Greece. It's the divination by Sivan Shears.
Okay.
Often invoking the names of St. Peter and St. Paul. And by the time that the cunning folk are working this form of divination, it's usually to identify thieves and things like that. And when the sieve turns on someone's name is when you have the culprit. And I think it might be Agrippa talks about demons or spirits being responsible for the turning of the sieve.
Right.
But usually the names I see associated with it are Peter and Paul.
Okay. So take us through the process of it, because yes, you will see this picture that I mentioned earlier of two hands coming in from either side on the side of a pair of shears. And then the shears, they're open and hanging from the shear tips of the blades. You see a sieve. So what actually occurs during casinomancy?
Right. Yeah. Two people are typically holding it just by their little fingers,
right?
Is usually how we see it interpreted. And they are maybe saying psalms beforehand or various prayers and invocations. Paul or other spirits in order to get things started. And they are listing names and waiting for that moment where just between the two fingers, it starts to move on its own, this balanced, carefully balanced sieve and shears. It's really fascinating. There's something to it that almost reminds me of like the table tipping of mediums,
right?
Or using like a pendulum or something like that. You're passively waiting for this movement to happen as you go through the litany of names to come to the right person.
Amazing.
The culprit in most cases.
Fantastic. You talked about how the name of St. Peter and St. Paul were evoked during casinomancy. How important were saints to the cunning craft? I know probably they'd be more apparent in, say, areas like France or Italy, but also very much in the British Isles. So the saints, were they big for the cunning folk?
Yeah, I think it depended, again, on the individual cunning person. You see sometimes Protestant magicians writing notes and margins, I'm not going to do all that Catholic nonsense.
Oh.
If there's like maybe a litany of saints that you're supposed to say before an operation or something like that. Alternately, even in manuscripts like the one that was published as Book of Oberon, I believe there is a conjuration to make St. George appear as a spirit, which is really interesting. So even if you are not actively working as a spirit in and of itself, you still often find saints called on before operations to conjure other spirits. It's almost like you are summoning your spiritual backup, your little army of saints to stand behind you with their hands on you to keep you safe and clean when you're working with unclean spirits. But that's kind of almost a more passive way that you see more often, I think, in the British Isles. Whereas in France and in other Catholic countries, you see novenas to saints prescribed as remedies or as operations in and of themselves. Maybe someone needs to say that after they have their witchcraft cure to make sure it's maintained in some sense. And Jean-Pauvre Sada, who I mentioned earlier, she, in the Unwitcher that she's interviewing in her work, talks about medals of Saint Benedict being hung over doors and windows to guard against the intrusion of spirits or witches.
Right.
In Spain, the people you might identify as cunning folk were definitely calling on saints really actively, not just to cleanse and guard victims of witchcraft, but to carry out spells. Saint Martha, for example, which we think of as maybe being really popular figure in African-American hoodoo and conjure, was also popularly invoked to control abusive men or straying husbands in early modern Spain.
Yeah.
So there's definitely this sense that the saints were called upon in different areas to perform different functions, whether they were carrying out operations or they were standing guard over you, presence of them that are explicit or implicit. But they like to hang around the cunning folk to some degree or another.
I love it. That's great. I'm a huge fan of saints. How important were plants and animals in what we'd like to call, in air quotes, nature to the cunning folk? Were they digging up the dirt? Were they going through the root systems to find things to use for like tinctures, or use the word potions just to make everybody understand what I'm talking about? But were they constantly going out and gathering these things?
Yes, definitely. We definitely see that happening. Like the cunning folk weren't practicing fertility or nature-based religion like contemporary Wicca, but they were definitely making use of plant and animal allies in a lot of different ways, what I would identify as community with these plants and animal allies. Joan Peterson, for example, she was a cunning woman who is said to have learned her trade from a squirrel, according to her son.
Awesome.
Yeah, and a servant girl also who talked about seeing the squirrel climb into her bed and things like that and whisper in her ear. Other cunning folk like Anne Bodenham or Mary Parrish were so knowledgeable about where which plants they worked with grew, when they were growing, how best to harvest them. So I'd like to think that they weren't viewing nature as like a distant other to be worshipped, but the natural world was really important to them and in some sense part of their community. Operations involving plant allies, ways of relating to or like integrating them into human or human-esque relationships were also present in the texts used by cunning folk.
Right.
MS Additional 3544, which is a Tudor working book published as the Cambridge Book of Magic.
Awesome.
Has an operation for wedding yourself to marrying a valerian plant, which then becomes an ally in works of magic, health, love, friendship. Oberon, which keeps coming up, has an operation for evoking the spirit of an elder tree, which appears to the magician as a beautiful woman in order to receive a wish-fulfilling herb. So it's like you're summoning the spirit of a tree to then give you a plant ally to work with. So there's definitely these layers and ways that they worked with the world around them.
Now, to go to the thing I opened the show with, familiars. Usually we think of familiars as being in the domain of witches, but what function did they hold for cunning folk? Did cunning folk use familiars as well, either familiar spirits or animal spirits? How familiar were the cunning folk with familiars?
I would say in the context of the British Isles especially, we often see these little spirits that we might identify as familiars today, or were sometimes identified as familiars even then. That were in relationship with cunning folk. I feel like it's good to talk about specific examples here. Like we have Joan Peterson, who I talked about with WMiT as a familiar, right, coming to teach her magic at night. 16th century cunning woman Ursula Kemp's son said his mother kept 4 familiars. One was a gray cat, one was a white lamb, one was a black toad, and one was a black cat. And she kept them in earthenware pots, suggesting these weren't entirely natural, mundane animals. And she might, she sometimes in her trial claims that she never hurt anyone with her magic, while at other times claiming she sent her familiars to sicken people or to kill them or to hurt their cattle. So there's some sense like with her, she might have been playing both ends of the game, causing witchcraft and curing it. And Bodenham, who I mentioned is one of my favorites, she had spirits that came to her as ratty boys. And when they appeared, her dog and her cat stood up on their hind legs to dance with these children. We also have Joan Willamot, I think is how you say her name, in 1618, who claimed that a fairy named Pretty was how she obtained her powers, and that this fairy was breathed into her mouth by a cunning man named William Barry, and that Pretty came weekly to let her know who was sick in her community, how she could heal them. So there's definitely this sense, especially among cunning women, of smaller spirits that taught or revealed knowledge to them and helped them in carrying out their work, whether it was for good or for bad. And sometimes these spirits were initiators and authority figures to the cunning folk, a servile or working function where they were almost like laborers carrying out spells. So I think they definitely had familiars as part of their spiritual relationships, and that they served a really wide variety of functions.
Amazing. Yeah. I got to ask though, and again, hard to tell through time. And again, I'm not going to ask for a percentage. Do you think that there were more women cunning folk than there were cunning men? Or do you think that they were somewhat, it was somewhat equal? If you were to ballpark it, what would you say? Would there be more women engaging in cunning craft than men?
I think it's Owen Davies who says that as far as records go, there was more men than women.
Okay.
My interest has often been focusing on the women because they are so often sidelined as witches.
Right.
And once they sort of become witches, then they're part of this anonymous gestalt of the witch.
Right.
Instead of being retrieved as like living individuals who were also magical professionals and were also working with grimoires and are worth sort of studying in and of themselves. But I think this varies based on region, and maybe it was more often men, or maybe men left more of a record than the women did. It's hard to say.
It's one of those things probably lost to history, but we know that men and women were engaging in cunning craft, which is awesome. I just think that's wonderful. Aerinn, what role did the dead play in cunning traditions?
We definitely see necromancy coming up in a lot of operations in books that the cunning folk would have worked with. And then sometimes we see it also in the records that we have left behind. One of the primary spiritual relationships for Mary Parrish was the spirit of a prisoner who she'd been in love with while they were in prison together.
Right.
And when he was executed, he's said to have gone to his death as a man to his wedding day because he'd struck this deal with Mary to serve her in death, to come back as a sort of familiar spirit to her. And in the 16th century, we have Bessie Dunlop, who received magical tuition from the spirit of a man named Thomas Reed, who had died maybe a generation earlier. Many working books and grimoires in libraries of the Cunning Folk featured necromantic operations. And we can also think of saints as spirits of the dead, of course.
Right.
But there's definitely a lot of various kinds of necromancy going on, although to different degrees, of course, based on individual practices.
Yeah. Do you think that it would have tipped into this person's just a cunning folk, but if they would to see this person in, say, a graveyard or hanging around areas where the dead congregate, that would have tipped them a bit more into the witchcraft territory, so they might avoid it a bit more? Or do you think that they might have been more active in heading to certain places that we would consider up there with necromantic activity?
Yeah, I mean, that might have tipped the hand one way or another for sure. But I feel like the thing that more often ends up tipping the scales in that way is, are they doing something to hurt someone?
Right.
Rather than the kind of spirit that they're working with. That might make them seem a lot creepier to people. That might cause different kinds of rumors.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that necromancy was necessarily seen as like hand in hand with witchcraft all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think would have raised eyebrows, seeing someone in the graveyard at the witching hour collecting grave dirt or harvesting flowers, valerian or yarrow growing on someone's grave or what have you.
Right.
Definitely would have raised some brows.
One individual that you've brought up a couple of times in the show is Mary Parrish, who is she's one of those people that I think that should be up there with like Dee and Kelly, just incredible figure. As you said, yeah, she had a familiar, a dead gentleman by the name of George Whitmore, who one of her associates, Goodwin Wharton, would say that he wasn't allowed to be around when Mary was communicating with George, but he would stand outside of the room and he would hear two voices talking. But Mary I'm going to do an episode on her one day because I have to, but I really think her story is one that needs to be told. And if people are interested, there's a book called The Magical Adventures of Mary Parrish by Francis Timbers. That's pretty much my favorite cunning woman. But I have to ask you, Aerinn, do you have a person whose stories of their cunning adventures and their deeds that really resonate or you find just really fun?
Yeah, I do love Mary Parrish.
Good.
She is amazing, if somewhat tragic figure.
Yeah.
But I think one of my very favorites would be Anne Bodenham.
Okay.
And her story is mostly revealed in the 1653 pamphlet, Dr. Lamb Revived or Witchcraft Condemned. So she was an older woman by the time this was published, and she was, of course, accused and tried for witchcraft, which is how we have the records of many of these cunning women. But for many years prior, she had taught children to read. She had served as a cunning woman in her community of Wiltshire. And this pamphlet really reveals such force of personality, to pride that she had that I just really admire. When she was younger, and we don't really have a timeline for this, but at some point, long before she was accused of witchcraft, she had apprenticed herself to the infamous cunning man, Dr. John Lamb, who was an astrologer, a necromancer, a diviner, a physician. She served him as a servant, or so she claims.
Right. And
she says that that's where she got her knowledge from. She learned her trade from him.
Right.
But she didn't stop there. She had books of magic. She returned to Wiltshire and built seemingly quite a practice for herself, being she was able to, on her death, leave legacies to her friends. She and her husband had a house of their own and so much detail in her life. And in addition to healing illness, curing witchcraft, advising clients about lucky days and inauspicious days, and all of the usual stuff about cunning folk that they're doing, she just has so much personality that shines through in this pamphlet that discusses her treating her clients kindly, how she loved to gossip, how much she loved books. She really talks about books so much, which I find super fascinating and really relate to.
Yeah.
And how she traded magical manuscripts with people in her community and in other regions. And there's so much detail about how she conjured spirits that's present in this pamphlet. And I just really love her. And she was unfortunately, of course, accused of witchcraft, which led to her imprisonment and eventual execution.
Ugh.
And she was so adamant throughout that she was not a witch, that she would never practice witchcraft, and that these accusations of witchcraft were going to just break her husband's heart.
Oh.
So I think that there's just something really beautiful about how adamant she was about her identity and what mattered to her, and that she had people who came to her defense and who said she was just a healer. She was nothing more than a healer. Yeah, when she was executed, she had very specific instructions for how she wanted to be buried, taken home first, have her garden torn up, and then she wanted to be buried under the gallows.
Wow.
There is so much folklore, right, about magic that happens at the gallows, or
right.
spirits that come up at the gallows, or the infamous mandrake growing
right.
at the foot of the gallows. And people really seem to have a certain amount of respect, or maybe a mix of respect and fear for her. Even the executioner begged her forgiveness when he had to kill her. And she said, "Forgive thee, a pox on thee, turn me off." And those are her last words before she was executed.
Damn.
It's just like so fucking legendary to me. She always really gets me like really excited and emotional, because there's just so much to her story, and she had such a force of personality, and she bragged that she was better than William Lilly and all of these other contemporary magicians.
Nice.
And so we know that she was working Mars and she was practicing necromancy, and yet she sort of just becomes a footnote in other people's history. Even this pamphlet that's about her is called Dr. Lamb Revived.
Right.
Even though he was just her teacher from years ago.
Yeah.
She's really determined, it seems to me, to be heard, even from beyond the grave.
It's frustrating for me because I love the history of magic as much as being a practical magician myself. But the stories of people like Mary Parrish, they are way more human, and you can connect with them far easier than, say, going through something. I'm just going to use it as an example because it was my last episode, Dee and Kelly. I find a lot of things I can identify with Dee and Kelly, but their ambitions were just up in the stratosphere, whereas Mary Parrish, to me, I can connect with her on many levels. The hunt for treasure, that all of these things, it's like, yeah, that's kind of why I got into magic from the beginning.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I completely agree. They were just living members of their communities, trying their damnedest to get by.
Yeah.
Their loftiest ambitions were things that are very relatable to us now. They want to have a good life. They want to make sure their community members have a good life, and not to put on rose-tinted glasses and say they were all these like wonderful, benefic people. They were just working class, which I think is a really amazing frame or lens to look at them through, because so many of us are, and their magic is really living in a community setting instead of in, an ethereal other world. They were very of the here and now and of the moment, living and breathing people who loved to drink and had partners and, frequented pubs and struggled with their businesses and things like that. It's just, they're so much more human to me than a lot of the more courtly magicians like Dee. And no shade to Dee that he was doing anything, awful, but it's just not as relatable for me.
100%. Yeah, that's very well put. I love it. Yeah, their magic is, in a way, an extension of their lives, and by extension, the way that a lot of us live our lives today, which is, how do I get through the day? What can I do to help others? And what can I do to help myself? Love it. Aerinn, thank you so much for sharing that. I have to ask, though, were cunning folk persecuted more often than not, or were they left alone for the most part? Again, talking about the time scale in different areas, but
yeah, it's a mixed bag. I mean, they were persecuted, absolutely. In the context of England, maybe to a greater extent the rest of the British Isles, their trade was illegal. There was various laws against sorcery, against cozening, against unlicensed medical practice, fraud, laws against witchcraft, and all of these were deployed at various points against cunning folk to censure or imprison them. And of course, the accusation of witchcraft was the most dangerous. That was the most likely to result in execution. There was definitely persecution that was happening with them. But at the same time, a lot of them seemed very undeterred. I mean, talking about Mary Parrish, she was operating out of a pub when Goodwin Morton first meets her, peddling gambling charms, I believe.
Right.
That's about as public as it can get, right? Just brazenly out there. There's a cunning man that Dr. Al talks about, and I can't recall his name now, who went to the authorities to help them solve a crime, I believe.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, we have to arrest you now. You can't come here and tell us that you're doing this.
Yeah.
So there definitely was persecution happening, legal persecution, and occasionally, we see clerical authorities against them, but they weren't going to stop doing what they were doing by any means.
Amazing. Yeah, I think of the story that Dr. Al, he also mentioned that on our episode, that they said, we have to persecute you now. And it was the rest of the village that came up and they're like, don't do that. We need this guy. This is a really essential part of our community. And they're like, okay, you're good to go. I love it. That's the best. I mean, what's the point of being cunning if you can't get a little bit of help from your friends, right?
Right. Yeah. And I love when we see clients coming to the cunning person's defense, because that's a repeated theme that seemed to happen a fair bit. So we're definitely not talking about people that were exclusively seen as like awful, evil magicians doing dastardly things, but people still really seem to love them oftentimes.
Yeah, it's so good. You have talked about how a lot of your work and a lot of your understandings come from the British Isles, and particularly British Isles cunning traditions. Why is this? Why does this place speak to you? Do you find that the magic, if you practice it yourself, to be a bit more efficacious than other forms of magic that you've tried? Why the British Isles for you?
The easy answer and the true answer is that I'm a monolinguist.
Okay.
I have ancestry coming from the British Isles, but also I really only speak English. I really only read English, and that limits me. I do like to get outside of that when I can. I love reading works about magicians from France, especially I have some ancestry there, and it was my grandfather's first language.
Okay.
I, love trying to find snippets here and there that I can about cunning folk in other regions. But the bulk of what is available to me, especially if I'm trying to find resources like trial pamphlets and things like that, it's going to end up being in English.
Okay.
So I don't necessarily think that makes it superior. Like, oh, the English cunning folk were the superior cunning folk with the most efficacious magic. But it does work.
Yeah.
And I find it really beautiful and enriching, and slate outward to other areas and learn more.
Awesome. I love it as well. We don't have, well, we kind of do in a way. Actually, we definitely do in a way. We have what we would consider the modern version of cunning folk. Everybody's got on their Twitter page, Ko-fi me or Ko-fi me some money, and I'll help you out with the tarot divination and stuff like that. But what factors eventually saw the decline of cunning folk and their traditions across Europe specifically?
I think that disenchantment definitely played a major role, which to some degree or another was an active project of changing how people saw and related to the world, contributed to the decline of cunning folk. The British Isles specifically, and this happened in France, I believe, to some extent as well. The centralization of medical training, the licensing of medical professionals, various periods of increased witch hunting and witch paranoia, and development of new systems of magic, medicine, and spirituality that cloak themselves in the guise of science, like mesmerism or spiritualism.
Yeah.
And seemed sophisticated in some way and played into disenchantment or the goals of the Enlightenment to science-ify things in a sense. And not that there's not useful things that came out of spiritualism or spiritism or things like that, but it certainly did play into the decline of things like spiritualism and mediumship that could happen in the parlor, that could function as a social event,
right,
and really appealed to the upper class, definitely removed from the cunning folk the wealthiest of their patrons, because we did see people from all classes going to the cunning folk. It wasn't limited just to working class people seeking out working class cunning folk.
Yeah.
You know, it was people from the aristocracy seeking out cunning folk as well.
Cool.
And yeah, all of these things kind of conspired to make a perfect storm of what spelled the eventual decline of cunning folk. Although I'm happy to see that there's some resurgence in interest in them and how they plugged into their communities and functioned as almost axes, linchpins of their communities.
Awesome. Do you have any opinion on somewhat recent figures like, say, I know I have a couple of fans of Andrew Chumbley, fairly modern figure, passed away quite a few years ago. Well, not quite a few years ago, but more than a decade ago. Do you have any opinion on the way that contemporary-ish figures have incorporated cunning traditions of yore to create something new and modern with magic? Or do you see, like, I go a little bit further back into the past? What's your take on the new cunning?
I think it's what Chumbley did was really interesting. I haven't engaged with a lot of the operations that he has outlined in his various texts. I have read some of them, though, and some of it's really fascinating and beautiful even. He was an amazing artist, and I think that artistry, from what I'm familiar with, it seems like a lot of it's focused more on a kind of mysticism or like almost like a theurgy in a witch's or a cunning person's hat.
Yeah.
Rather than like the practical magic that the cunning folk were using to sort of solve real world rubber meets the road kind of problems.
Yeah.
I don't mean to say that to shade Andrew Chumbley, because
Okay.
I do find his work really beautiful and compelling. And on that level, I'm for sure a fan, but I don't necessarily identify it with cunning craft, even though he kind of frames it that way. And the Bad Eye, or that are fans of the cultist the Bad Eye, sort of might end up seeing his work as like a one true historical cunning craft,
right?
Which it isn't. It like definitively isn't.
Yeah.
But I really don't want that to come across as like gatekeeping or like saying anything like shady or catty about Chumbley, because there's some beautiful stuff going on there, and that none of this is to say it's not efficacious or that it doesn't work.
Right.
It isn't, to me, what I think of as cunning craft.
Got it. What benefits can one gain from not only studying cunning traditions and the history of cunning folk, but perhaps instituting I'm going to put some air quotes around this, cunning mindset when engaging with people's individual forms of practice?
I think that the biggest takeaway is that coming at things the cunning mindset offers is it gets you to think outside of yourself.
Right.
A lot of people come into Western magic, like quote unquote Western magic, including myself, asking, what can this do for me?
Right.
Which is absolutely important and vital. We have to take care of ourselves first. But the cunning folk really put such an emphasis on what happens after that. What happens after you're helping yourself? And again, I don't want to overly romanticize them. They weren't necessarily doing this out of the wanted to make money. They wanted to survive. But it still plugs into a community. Right. Whether that's a community of spirits, a community of other than human plant and animal allies, a community of living, breathing people. They were community workers, even if they were doing it for selfish reasons. And so I think that coming at magic with the mindset of a cunning person is sort of coming at these texts or traditions that they were working with as a sort of magical social worker or counselor or matchmaker or healer, plugging themselves and their practices into the lives of others to support them in some way. And so my own practice and my own research into the trade of cunning folk has invited me to think about that also. How can I magically support my community, whether that's my friend who's having troubles in like their love life, or that's the spirit attached to the ghost bike down the street at the crossroads.
Right.
Helping them spirit, I think, is part of helping your community as well.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you might even find that like those two things are connected.
Right.
Maybe it's that restless spirit who is somehow interfering with your friend's love life that you're trying to help. So coming at, I think, magic with that mindset of a cunning person is really about thinking outside of yourself, not necessarily being like selfless, but it's definitely widening your scope of like, how do I relate to the world magically? But how is the world relating magically back to me? Awesome. And how can I improve this for myself and for the people around me?
Amazing. I like the idea of what happens after you've taken care of yourself. And the best answer to that is help others, truthfully, and make a little bit of cash on the side, right? I mean, what's the point of being a magician if you can't make a little bit of money, right? I'm not wrong. In your opinion, what is the best way of starting in the cunning arts? Like, would you recommend trying to find a community of some kind, or just go through some books? Like, what's the best way of sparking the fire that would cause somebody to be really interested in a cunning practice?
I keep saying community, and that is important. Although I don't know if there's a lot of community right now of people who call themselves or who are practicing the historical practices of cunning folk.
Right.
So I think for me, all I can say is like what sparked my interest. There's certainly great academic texts out there like Owen Davies' Popular Magic, Cunning Folk in English History, Jim Baker's The Cunning Man's Handbook. And of course, those are focusing more on the sort of Anglo-American end of things.
Right.
But you can also look at sort of ethnographies like Jean Fabre-Sada's work that was looking at anti-witchers in 20th century France. There are other sources out there coming from an academic perspective, examining the lives and works of cunning folk, which I think is really important to have that background to see what they were really doing. And then there's an increasing number of magical miscellanies that were recorded by cunning folk and now being published as books like the Book of Oberon or the King's Book of Magic. Mm-hmm. And we have the trial pamphlets also.
Right.
So you can see what they were doing and hear their words to some extent, or at least their words according to the author of the pamphlet.
Right.
So I think that those are all really good ways of delving into what were these people doing? How can it be applicable to a modern life? How can it be brought up to speed? And then I like forming spiritual relationships with the cunning folk in and of themselves who came before us, sort of as heroes or pseudo ancestors to aspire to or emulate or whose paths we might be able to walk in. So we're not just having to constantly beat our own new path.
Right.
And we've talked about the good doctor, Al Cummins, who's been doing some amazing work in the past year, especially teaching classes online through like Wolf and Goat or the Cauldron Black or Catlin Books.
Right.
And I occasionally sneak in there to teach some classes of my own.
Awesome.
I'm really happy to see that, there's this revival happening through printed text, through classes, through people just talking about these things. Yeah, it's really beautiful. And I think it's this community-based renaissance is something we really need to see in a culture right now.
I agree entirely. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Aerinn, and I apologize, but 5 books. My people come to my podcast for the book recommendations, I hope. But 5 books to get people started on the right path. We've talked about Oberon. Maybe something like Arthur Gauntlet might make their way in there. But for you, what are your 5 books?
I would definitely say Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, Pseudo-Agrippa's 4th book of occult philosophy, which includes the Arbital and Heptameron, Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. I absolutely adore Arthur Gauntlet, the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, of Angels, Demons, and Spirits, the Book of Oberon. There's so many good ones out there. I also love some that are like the Book of Gold, which was widely disseminated in France.
Yeah.
And has a lot of good sort of ready-made spells, which I think are really useful, especially if you're coming in as a beginner.
Yeah.
Because you can just turn to the Psalms.
Yeah.
And the ingredients can be really simple, and you don't necessarily have to start in the deep end by like doing the long conjurations to summon a spirit to form a relationship,
right,
which is absolutely worthwhile. But if you want something that's kind of ready-made, I think something like the Book of Gold provides a beautiful entry point.
The Book of Gold is such a, wow, I'm glad you mentioned that one, because it is an incredible book. Oh, guess what? Have the Book of Psalms and a couple of ingredients and you're good to go. I totally forgot about that book, but it's, I believe Dave Rankin did the editing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, such a great book. I love it. Yeah, Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits as well. Great suggestions. Thank you, Aerinn. Sorry to put you on the spot. These days, how does one come to define themselves as cunning in your mind?
That's such a loaded question.
I know. I'm sorry. I have to. I'm known for asking the hard questions.
No, it's a really good question. And it's one I ask myself because we're certainly not living in the same era.
Yeah.
We're not all going to be good Christians or bad Christians or Christians at all.
Right.
There was a book I read some time ago about medicine in early modern France that made a really beautiful observation between that they identified as wife and a practitioner who would be like a cunning person. So I think all of us have the ability within us to be someone like the bonne femme and has a few tricks up our sleeves to help our family or to help a neighbor, do magical tricks or little herbal recipes or things like that. And that's a beautiful place to start.
Yeah.
But what makes someone a cunning person, I think, is taking it to the next level, is becoming more of a generalist, having more of an arsenal of things that you know work, and being able to tailor things to the specific needs of your clients, and to providing the sort of classic services of the cunning person, divination, love magic, protection, unwitching, all of these things and more, and being really a well-rounded magical practitioner and being available and of service to people is what separates the cunning person from someone who is just helping out their family or just helping out themselves.
I like the idea of having a magical arsenal because this might sound a little bit trite, but to call oneself cunning requires cunning in a way. It's when somebody approaches you with the problem, you can come at it from several different angles to be able to get to the most effective way of helping this person with their problem. So perhaps to call yourself cunning is just being cunning. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, once your cunning is sort of deep or broad enough, that's really when you're cooking with fire as a cunning person and not just helping yourself or helping, your neighbor. I think of, this is a very different tradition, but a friend who's a practitioner of African-American conjure, telling me about his mother once. Oh, his mother has one trick. And she puts people's names in ice cube trays. And according to him, she's not a conjure woman.
Right.
She has a trick, and there's a difference. And that's not that wasn't to be shady to his own mother or anything like that. It's just to differentiate between knowing how to do one thing is not the exact same thing as being highly skilled professional who can do 5 different things.
Right.
So I think that breadth of what you're able to do and who you're helping with it is what separates the cunning person from other types of practitioners.
Awesome. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a little second here, Aerinn, and maybe you can apply some thoughts. But when going through the history of magic for myself, you start to read accounts written by certain magicians at a certain period of time, and you see something that doesn't look right. And they are talking about things, to use an example, say the grave of Christian Rosenkreutz or Freemasons and sub-Masonic orders. And you look at this history and you go, something's not right here. they're talking about this tradition, this perennial philosophy that has existed for all this time. And then when you get down and squint and look at it, a lot of it looks like nonsense. A lot of it looks like it's not true. And so when you cut that out, it doesn't mean that you get rid of the history of magic itself, because the real history of magic for a period of time were cunning folk. It's an incredibly beautiful history. They were the ones continuing the real continuum of magic itself. So I think that there is just such a great, wonderful breadth of really human magic and people that we can actually literally say, oh, these people existed. These people were actually doing things. And they're in a way like almost role models as to how we should try to approach magic these days. So as I said, I think that a true history of magic for a period of time sits with the cunning folk and sits with cunning traditions. I don't know if you would agree, Aerinn.
Yeah, I think that is true to a certain extent. Absolutely. I mean, even Paracelsus, I think, talks about how you have to seek out old wives and bandits and Romani people to learn the real magic.
Yeah.
And so talking about people who are often working class people serving themselves, their villages, their communities, rather than, the grand high magi serving just aristocrats and kings and queens and things like that. It's not to say they weren't doing magic too, but I really like that there is this sense that the nitty gritty of what works lays with the people who needed it to work because their survival really depended on it.
Yeah, fantastic. Aerinn, this has been such a pleasure, and I just love everything that you had to say and all of your perspectives. So thank you so much for being on the show. We have to know what's going on in the world of the Wise Woman of Bushwick Avenue. What do you got going? You have a blog. You've got some other things. So let the people know, because I think that your perspectives are really quite incredibly pertinent in this day and age. And as a fan of cunning folk traditions, I'm all for it.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. I've been so happy to have a chance to talk about one of my passions, and you've had such insightful questions. I really appreciate you having me on here. You can find me at my website, which is AerrinnHodges.com, which I do blog on occasionally. You can also find me on Instagram, which is just at Aerinn Hodges, my name again. I do teach occasionally through Catland Books here in Brooklyn, as well as being available for things like magical consultations. And I will be teaching a class coming this summer at Cauldron series, The Mighty Dead, about Anne Bodenham with the good Dr. Al Cummins as my co-teacher.
Wonderful.
And I'm really looking forward to it.
Do you have a book in the works? I mean, I have to ask.
I don't at the moment.
Okay.
If someone wants to approach me with an offer, I'd be more than happy. But at the moment, I am just plugging away, surviving our plague days right now.
Just doing the cunning thing. Cunning is as cunning does, right?
That's right.
Aerinn, this has been such a fantastic pleasure to have you on the show. And I really want people to check out your work. Your blog is wonderfully, I believe there's a couple of articles up there. One, Enchanting the Bedroom, but you also had another article. And as soon as I opened it up, it's like, oh, there's a video with Robin Wall Kimmerer in there. And it's like, oh, I think this person and I are going to get along. And it's wonderful that you're writing. So the reason I had to ask about the book is because you have some wonderful perspectives. And I hope that people find your work and they find out what you're doing. And I hope they take your classes as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, the kind words. And I hope that people can derive some sort of, operative functional magic from, my writings and enrich their own practices and their own lives. That's really my goal.
Wonderful. I will have links to places to find Aerinn's work, to her blog, Love and Blight, as well as links to her Instagram account, but more importantly, to a link that she has to a class that's coming up on the Cauldron Black with Dr. Alexander Cummings about Anne Bodenham, which will take place on June 10th of 2021. So please, everybody, check that out. It's going to be amazing. I'm probably going to try and get in on it. So, I think this would be a great way to learn a little bit more about a real, true, cunning woman, Anne Bodenham. So All of the links to find Aerinn's work will be up on the show notes at whatmagicisthis.com. I'll have some other really interesting books. This is going to be some amazing show notes for Cunning Folk. I don't think that you'll find a better resource for getting the information about this incredibly important aspect of magic, of historical, real magic that was a phenomenon for a long period of time. So all of those book suggestions, all of the article suggestions will be up at the show notes to whatmagicisthis.com. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find a link to my Twitter account, to my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review for me, either on iTunes or on Stitcher or anywhere that reviews can be left. I know the whole star clicky thing is fun. It's easy. It's one and done. Just, yeah, I like the show. 5 stars. There you go, Douglas, whatever. But if you want to write some words have agency, folks, and people do read those reviews. And if you really enjoy my show and you have something positive to say about it, please try to leave a written review of What Magic Is This? Let me know how much you love the show. Let the other people know how much you love the show. And perhaps they might click on the podcast and give it a listen, and I've made a new fan. And that's all good, because a fan of What Magic Is This is a fan of the world of magic. If you enjoy the show as well, please tell a friend. If they're weird and wacky and crazy like you, then chances are they might like the podcast. And that also gets me another fan. Woo! More fans. Always better. Anyways, but yes, if you tell a friend, perhaps they'll tell a friend and they'll tell a friend. I don't do the best at promoting my own podcast. So word of mouth, I think, is a powerful thing. And it's one of the best ways of getting to share the love that is What Magic Is This? If you enjoy the show and you feel like you want to support it, because at this point, What Magic Is This is basically my life, and I love it and I enjoy it, and I hope that comes through each and every time you download an episode or throw it on the, I don't know what people are using these days, CD players still, iPods. Do people still have iPods? It doesn't matter. This podcast is my life, and if you feel like the work that I'm doing is somewhat important, not just with the episodes themselves and the guests that I get on here, but also through the show notes, the amazing show notes that I put on there, then best way to support is through Patreon. And that is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I don't have any tiers besides one. It's $7 a month. That is the price of a dilapidated house plant in the bargain bin at Home Depot. $7 is the price of a fancy drink. It's the price of a really good bottle of dishwashing detergent. And that's all I ask for a month. And that helps to keep the show alive and running, and it keeps me happy and doing what I do up on Patreon. I give exclusive content every month. I just uploaded a 40-minute video. 40 minutes! That's basically a 1-hour TV show with commercials up on my Patreon. I just went through how to petition St. Expedite. I went through some of the things to have on an altar. It's not me just staring into the camera and talking. I actually show you what to do and go through all of it. In fact, here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to share a little bit of a tidbit of an episode that I recently released about Hermanubis, which was a combination of two gods, which would be Anubis from Egypt and Hermes from the Greek lexicon of gods. So here's a little sample of the kind of content that I put up on Patreon. So, who/what is Hermanubis? Everybody loves Hermanubis. There's something endearing about Hermanubis. And if you've ever seen a picture, or more specifically a statue that exists in the Vatican, there's just something alluring. People, they want to get statues of Hermanubis to put on their altars. It's all really good, and he's becoming a bit more popular these days again, which is always good to see. I'm all for it, definitely. But what exactly was going on with this deity, with this god? Well, Hermanubis is the result of syncretism. Hermanubis was popular during the Roman reign in Egypt itself, particularly in Alexandria, Egypt. In fact, Hermanubis is almost seemingly distinctly Alexandrian. there was a temple of Hermanubis, and this temple can actually be seen on coins of Emperor Antonius Pius. There were many priests to Hermanubis in Alexandria. He was very, very popular. And Hermanubis featured in quite a lot of art, not just in Alexandria, but also in Egypt and in Tunisia and in a lot of places within the Roman world. So if you like the sound of that, Patreon is the place to go, because I put out at least 2 things every month about content that I don't think should be in the main podcast, but I still think that they're very, very important. So I do things about gods and goddesses, as well as entities and saints and demons, plenty of other really great things. So if you can't get enough What Magic Is This, the best place to get more would be the Patreon. And that can be found at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. If you don't feel like the whole, I want to pay Doug $7 every month, I just want to throw him some money, I have a PayPal Me account as well. That's up on whatmagicisthis.com. Everybody knows the PayPal logo. It's there in the menu. It's at the bottom of the page. Just hit that and you can donate to me $5, $10, $500, even 50 cents. It doesn't matter. It all goes to help the show, and it keeps this show running. But unfortunately, with the PayPal thing, there's no exclusive content, so you don't get more of the What Magic Is This magic, more or less. All of those things, everything that I've talked about over the last 6 minutes, can be available at whatmagicisthis.com. Aerinn, I hope if I was to ask you to come back on the show, you would.
Absolutely. This has been so fun and relaxing, and I'm a nervous person, so I really appreciate you putting me at ease and having just this good time talking about a favorite topic.
For sure, and we'll definitely have you back on, because we just scratched the surface, truthfully. Maybe we'll get you back on for Mary Parrish, because I could talk about Mary for forever. She's just a wonderful person. But that's the show, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that you'll come back to What Magic Is This, where we're going to talk about more of this wonderful, sieve-hanging, crazy, weird, healing, curse-breaking magic that you all love and enjoy. Until next time, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.